All right. So once again, my name is Bobby Jones Hanley, and I wanted to give a brief introduction for those of you who are new to the San Francisco Black and Jewish Unity Coalition. We are a grassroots organization made up of people of faith and or social activists who are committed to the causes of racial, social, and economic justice and dismantling systemic racism at the local, regional, and national levels. Our organization is made up of four focus areas or four committees. First, we have the Criminal Justice and Prison Reform Committee, which I am one of the co-chairs. Malcolm Gisson is our other co-chair for the Criminal Justice and Prison Reform Committee. That particular group really works to eliminate mass incarceration and dismantling the cradle to prison pipeline. Our focus areas include improving all aspects of policing, eliminating police brutality, emphasizing rehabilitation instead of punishment, expanding job training for incarcerated individuals, and we have a heavy focus on impacting criminal justice legislation and policy. If you would like to come to one of our next meetings, our meetings are the last Tuesday of every month from 5 to 6 p.m. We definitely invite you and you're welcome to join our committee
Thursday.
Or at least be able
Last
to.
Thursday, Bobby.
Excuse me?
Last Thursday, not Tuesday.
Nope. Ours is Criminal Justice and Prison Reform Committee is the last Tuesday, no problem. The last Tuesday of every month. Specifically, we go from 5 to 6 p.m. and our next meeting will be June 27th. So we'd love to have you join or at least come check out our Criminal Justice and Prison Reform Committee to see really what we're currently working on. The second committee is our civic engagement. This group works to promote a better quality of life for all residents of the San Francisco and Greater Bay Area community through both political and non-political processes that advance racial and economic justice. Our next committee meeting for the civic engagement will be July 6th at 6 p.m. The third committee is our Health and General Welfare Committee. Our Health and General Welfare Committee really focuses on advocacy for and with partner and local organizations that support local underserved communities, providing access to culturally appropriate healthcare, nutritional education, and healthy foods, housing security, spaces for physical activity, and mental health and substance abuse services. And lastly, our fourth committee is our Community and Economic Development group. They really have a focus on supporting programs that seek to keep the racial balance of San Francisco, reverse the decline of the Black population in our community, addressing things such as gentrification, as well as our work on reparations and more. And they meet on the third Thursday of the month. When you look at all of our four different committees, all of these committees have overlap with the discussion that we will be having tonight, reparations, right? And how do we correct these injustices and be able to create a more fair and just society for all. Now, for a little understanding of the format for today's meeting, normally we do introductions. Because tonight is going to be a lot larger group, we are asking people, if you are just joining, to go ahead and drop your name and the affiliation, if you have any, in the chat. That way we can have your information, know who you are, and also be able to communicate with you later on if you're interested in joining or at least attending one of our upcoming meetings for one of our committees. Also, the way that this format will work, normally we allow the meeting to be open, to have open discussions, which we do want to encourage and ask for people to drop. If they have questions, drop those questions in the chat. While you're dropping those questions in the chat, myself and a few of my colleagues will be getting those questions, sorting them, and putting them, sending them over to Rabbi Amy to facilitate those questions, to Dom. So definitely encourage you all to, if you have any questions or thoughts that come up, we want to be able to voice those. So please drop those questions in the chat, and we will go ahead and get those over to Amy so that she can ask Don about those specific things. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ann to say a few words on our reparations and what we've been doing in that area.
Thank you, Bobby, for opening our meeting. I feel so grateful to be a part of this group of people during these times. I want to say thank you to our devoted, hardworking, inspirational co-leads, Howard Lindsay and Malcolm Geeson, and to Rabbi Singer of Congregation Emmanuel, one of our co-founders. It's so good to see all of you here. Thank you for being here tonight and all the work and caring that you do for justice and making our society a better place for everyone. Many of you attended our teach-in on reparations last September at Congregation Shereth Israel in the historic and exquisite sanctuary on California Street. What a setting for our honored guests, Secretary of State Dr. Shirley Weber, who wrote SB 3121 that established the state task force, Reverend Amos Brown from Third Baptist, head of the San Francisco NAACP, vice chair of this state task force and a member of the San Francisco Advisory Committee on Reparations, and Eric McDonald, chair of the San Francisco Advisory Committee on Reparations, which is working on their own separate report and municipal recommendations that will be finalized soon. And we urge you to continue following their work and hearings and to lend support by contacting your supervisors. Our Unity Coalition has been studying the reparations movement for probably close to 3 years. I know many in our audience who have been part of the movement for decades, and we are inspired and motivated by you. The California Task Force has had hearings for almost 2 years. Their final hearing is on June 29 in Sacramento, when they will present their final report and recommendations. This is a copy of the draft document. What a history lesson this has been. In 4th grade public school in California, I love the history curriculum, the gold rush, the missions. My history education was, of course, supplemented in later years and at the college level, but so much I did not know until these historic hearings, the testimonies, this report, and the documentation. It's not easy. I hope you will take a look if you haven't done so already. And our special guest, Don Tamaki, will help us digest some of this. Tonight's talk and discussion will update us since our September teach-in. We're deeply honored to have Don with us, especially in this final month of the task force. Don, we can't thank you enough for your public service, dedication to truth and repair, and your wisdom, and for guiding us and the state of California through this historic process. Before I introduce Rabbi Amy Eilberg, who will introduce Don more formally, I'd like to mention the opportunity for allies to endorse the work of the California State Task Force. If you are part of a congregation or organization that can bring this to the attention of your leaders, or if you are those leaders, this is an important next step. Expanding the political will for reparations through allyship. Your congregation or group can go on the record now as a supporter. Don will tell us more, and you can reach out to us later, and we will follow up with many of you. Also, we're going to meet up on June 17th in the Fillmore for the Juneteenth festival that day, and would love to see you in real life. We'll pick a spot from 1 to 3 p.m. and get the word out through our email list and Facebook page. Rabbi Amy Eilberg is our moderator this evening. Many of you know Amy from her anti-racism work. It was kismet that we met Amy. That's actually not a Hebrew word for meant to be. Earlier this year, one of our members, Deborah Levy, who's with us, who is president of her Jewish congregation, Shahar Zahav, wrote a brilliant op-ed piece in the Bay Area Jewish paper on why her congregation supports reparations and calling on others to tangibly step up. Rabbi Amy reached out to us and asked for the next steps on furthering the cause. And here she is. Rabbi Amy Eilberg is the first woman ordained as a conservative rabbi, that's a movement, by the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. She serves as a spiritual director, peace and justice educator, and teacher of Musar, Jewish spiritual development. She currently serves as chair of the Racial Justice Subcommittee of the Conservative Movement's Social Justice Commission and as chair of Congregation Etz Chaim's anti-racism impact team on the peninsula. Her book, From Enemy to Friend, Jewish Wisdom in the Pursuit of Peace, was published by Orbis Books in March 2014. Rabbi Amy, thank you so much. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Anne. I so appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am humbled to be standing or sitting in my own kitchen, but in the virtual presence of so many people, including Anne and Bobby and other leaders of the coalition, whose activism has brought us all to the cusp of creating reparative policies and practices in California. And I'm especially honored to have had the opportunity to be in conversation with Don Tamaki, distinguished attorney and member of the task force, who will share some of his expertise with us in a few minutes. I know I will learn a great deal, and I hope you will too. But first, I want to ground us in teachings from Jewish tradition that support the idea and practice of reparations. Truly, there are few ideas more aligned with Judaism and the Jewish experience than the idea of reparations, for three main reasons. First, Jewish law is very explicit that it is forbidden to benefit from stolen goods. If we come across objects that were stolen, even that we didn't steal ourselves, but that were stolen by someone else, we are obligated to return them without question. We simply may not be enriched by theft and injustice, even if making it right is complex. Judaism is quite emphatic on this point. Second reason, Jewish tradition is intensely communal. Much of the language and focus of Jewish texts is communitarian and in the plural form. Even prayers that we might think of as intensely personal are recited in the plural. For example, as many of you know, our prayers of confession that one would think of as very personal prayers of inner exploration and yearning on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year, even these prayers of confession are recited in the first person plural. We actually beat our breasts just a little bit in a gesture of contrition. We have sinned, we have betrayed others, we have stolen, we have slandered, we have caused others to sin, and on through 23 sins, all listed in the first person plural. Everyone in synagogue rises and recites this prayer of confession again and again through the day of Yom Kippur, without asking, well, am I actually at fault for that one? No, someone in my community has surely committed the sin, and so the obligation to confess and atone is mine as well. It's a communal obligation. And the third reason why reparations is so aligned with Jewish tradition is that the theology and practice of tshuva, usually translated repentance, though it's more complicated than that, lies at the very heart of Jewish tradition and Jewish life. When we have harmed another, we are to undergo an elaborate process of atonement composed of no less than 7 steps. First, we must come to awareness about the transgression we've committed. Second, we must acknowledge that what we did was wrong and experience remorse for it, not just, I did it, but it was okay. Third, we must confess in public to what we have done. Fourth, we must apologize to the victim directly, if at all possible, for what we have done. And if the victim is dead or unavailable, that's not the end of the story. Jewish law prescribes alternate ways to fulfill this requirement. Fifth, we must pay restitution. That is, and this is so important, words, even heartfelt words of apology, are not enough without returning what was taken or compensating the victim for the harm that was done. And inversely, writing a check is also not enough. What is required by Jewish tradition is no less than a transformation of the heart. Sixth stage of the process of tshuva, we must undergo what the tradition beautifully calls soul reckoning. We must deeply explore the part of ourselves that allowed us to transgress in these ways and what needs to be done to change ourselves so we can never act in that way again. And seventh, finally, the test. When we have the opportunity to cause the same kind of harm again, and we choose not to do so, then and only then is our process of repentance complete. Now, because of what I said earlier about the communal focus of Jewish law and practice, it is clear that from the standpoint of Jewish tradition, every single one of these steps applies to collective harm as well, even if it takes some creativity to figure out how to construct the process of repair on the societal level. Most of us, I imagine, have heard the questions and resistances to the idea of reparations. Hey, I didn't construct the systems of racist oppression. My ancestors weren't even here when those systems were created. Or, why should just Black people be entitled to reparations? My people have been oppressed too. Or, how could we possibly compensate an enormous number of people for unfathomable losses that have taken place over 400 years? But those of us here are learning what to do. After all, Black leaders and writers have been teaching us about the reparations that are needed for the collective sins of slavery and ongoing racism since at least 1783, when the first payment of reparations was made on American soil. And now the California Reparations Task Force, after conducting 2 years of voluminous and penetrating work, is showing us the way to move forward. The state of California knows what to do. We just need to do it, and in doing so, teach the rest of the nation. I know with every fiber of my being that the values and texts of Jewish tradition obligate me and our whole community to stand unequivocally with the task force. I wish there were 10 times as many people in this room right now. That is, over time, what needs to happen. Those of us here, some of us Jewish, some of us Black, some of us Jewish and Black, and of other racial and ethnic groups as well, must rededicate ourselves to the work of creating a groundswell of popular support for the final report of the task force. Fair-minded people can disagree about specific recommendations, but on the fundamental moral obligation, there can be no question. Society must stand up in one voice and proclaim to the legislature that California must make the moral choice, leading the nation in a comprehensive program of reparations that can be a model for the nation. May we support one another in the moral clarity we need to move this work forward. May we continue to be given the strength we need for the hard work ahead. May we be nourished by the knowledge that what we seek is a response to a prophetic call for justice. And may we be blessed for our labors. I now have the great honor of introducing Don Tamaki. He's such a distinguished figure that it's remarkable that he wants us to call him Don. Don Tamaki, as many of you know, is senior counsel at Minami Tamaki LLP, having received his BA and JD from Berkeley. He co-founded the public interest law firm, the Asian Law Alliance in San Jose, and has served as the executive director of the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. In the 1980s, he was a member of the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark 1944 Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, overturning Mr. Korematsu's criminal conviction for defying the incarceration of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans. This was a signal moment in American history and in the history of anti-racist efforts. He currently is among the 9 members appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom and the legislature to serve on California's Reparations Task Force studying the cumulative historic and present day impact of 246 years of enslavement, 90 years of Jim Crow oppression, and 60 years of segregation and its vestiges, and what California should do to address these harms. I have learned that Don has encyclopedic knowledge of this material. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm sure I'll learn a great deal from what he has to say, and I suspect that you will too. Don, it's all yours.
Rabbi Albert, how am I supposed to follow you? I mean, that framing, it could not have been more perfect. I'm so grateful to you, and no less so to Ann Rubin, who's done a ton of work to put this program together, and also to so dedicated to the reparations issue. I want to thank everybody on this call. I did not expect this many people, frankly, on a Thursday night. Everybody's really busy, so thank you for your time, and thank you to the San Francisco Black and Jewish Unity Coalition for its long-standing, interest in this. I've learned a lot tonight, and as I said, Rabbi Albert, you're a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best here. So I realize that some in the audience have been following the task force very closely and are very knowledgeable about American and California history, while others on the call may be less familiar. For those who are knowledgeable, please bear with me. I don't want to preach to you or insult what you already know. I just hope to reiterate some things that you can use as talking points for your advocacy for reparations. So hopefully there'll be some useful things in here. And for those who are learning the basics of this issue, I hope to answer some of the most frequently asked questions. And I'm getting a lot of them. And some of them Rabbi Albert has actually listed. I also want to share some thoughts about why I'm committed to this issue and in this fight. I'm the only member of the task force who is not African American. So to say the least, my presence is conspicuous. I look like the guy in the task force photograph that has photobombed the picture. And like, who is that guy? So I think that requires some explaining. There's no equivalence between what Japanese Americans have experienced by way of racial profiling and exclusion, but there are some parallels, and there's a reason why so many Japanese American groups have really come out strongly to endorse reparations for African Americans. So let's get to it. I'm gonna do a little screen share here. All right. So the the title, and just the graphic content warning. There's a couple slides that are disturbing, so I wanted to give you a heads up on that. So as all people on this call know, on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered, triggering the largest protest in US history, calling for a racial reckoning. 4 months later, the legislature passed AB 3121, creating the task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. The purpose of the task force is to document the harm over the last 400 years, recommend ways to educate the public of our findings, and develop reparations proposals. 5 were appointed by the governor. The really keystone of San Francisco in many ways, and a key member of the task force, Dr. Amos Brown. Professor Cheryl Grills, a professor of psychology at Loyola Marymount. Lisa Holder, civil rights advocate and president of the Equal Justice Society, based in Oakland. Professor Javon Scott Lewis, he's the chair of the geography department of UC Berkeley, and then myself. We were appointed by the governor. And then on the bottom frames, Senator Stephen Bradley, of Los Angeles, San Diego Councilwoman Monica Montgomery Stepp, Assembly Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, and our chair, Camila Moore. So on June 1, as Ann mentioned, we published a sweeping, nearly 500-page report, drawing a through line from the harm of 246 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow and racial terror, and decade after decade more of racial exclusion and discrimination, resulting in today's outcomes, which are at once shocking, but sadly not surprising. Critics of reparations frequently note that California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state. So why is California leading the nation on this issue? And let me recite some history. The Civil War ended in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate laws and ways as close to slavery as possible. And no wonder, for 246 years, the U.S. had built one of the largest and most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The U.S. enslaved population was almost 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine for the entire country. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office. More than 1,700 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved Black people. The nation's constitution protected slavery and gave Southern states outsized political power. At the end of the Civil War, Congress seized land from wealthy Southerners, intending to distribute 40 acres to each formerly enslaved person to establish the economic means for self-sufficiency. In January of 1865, 400,000 acres from South Carolina to Florida were deeded to 40,000 formerly enslaved people who settled on and worked the land. But by April of 1865, Lincoln had been assassinated, and Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, declaring, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Johnson rescinded the land reparations program, ordered the Black settlers to leave their land, and land reparations was scrapped to assure peace among the states, but at an incalculable long-term cost to formerly enslaved people. During that 12-year post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction, Congress tried to give newly freed Black Americans access to basic civil rights, such as the right to vote. But white Northern support for Reconstruction collapsed. And to resolve the contested presidential election of 1876, Republicans and Democrats cut a deal to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. States, including California, passed poll taxes, literacy tests, refused to register African Americans for voting, and created other devices to prevent and suppress Black Americans from the voting booth. For example, in 1867, Black turnout was 90% in Virginia. After Virginia's voter suppression laws, Black voters dropped from 147,000 to just 21,000. California's Attorney General instructed county clerks not to register Black voters until Congress passed legislation commanding him to do so. It would take California another decade to change its constitution in 1879 to partly conform to the 15th Amendment's ostensible guarantees of the right to vote, and nearly another century to formally ratify the 15th Amendment, which was done in 1962, obviously modern day history. These restrictions secured the power of white politicians, allowing them to block hundreds of civil rights laws, and well into the 20th century, excluding Black Americans from the country's most important rights, creating America's middle class, such as Social Security and labor law protections, and racial terror followed. There were more than 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1955, and that is probably an undercount. We think of California as being more enlightened, but But while California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with enslavers entering California and taking their human property with them. California's 1849 anti-slavery state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved. From 1852 to 1855, the legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing persons escaping enslavement to be chased down, brought before a court, and sent back to the South, even if they had been living in the free state of California. In 1850, California banned African Americans from testifying against whites in court. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court likewise barred Chinese testimony against white people. The result? White people could commit crimes against African and Chinese Americans with impunity. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. Democrats rose to power in 1867 by vowing to fight against any new law that would make African Americans, Native Americans, or Chinese Americans equal to whites. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. By the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state, with sizable chapters emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Sacramento, Anaheim, and San Jose. During much of the 20th century, federal, state, and local government officials working with private individuals actively segregated America. This is a map by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation depicting the African American neighborhoods in West and East Oakland with a red tone, for which loans would be denied. These red line areas correspond to today's most ultra-segregated, underserved, and polluted areas of Oakland. When you align the redlining maps of the 1930s through the 1970s, created by lenders to exclude African Americans from being able to get federally insured loans, against today's maps of the most impoverished, underserved, and polluted neighborhoods, they align exactly. The discrimination of the not so distant past created our present. The Federal Housing Administration, the Veterans Administration, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped millions of mostly white Americans buy houses while refusing the same opportunity to Black Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in home loans, 98% of which went to white families. California was a leader in racially exclusionary policies. By 1940, 80% of the homes in Los Angeles contained racially restrictive covenants barring Black families. And when Black families moved into white neighborhoods, resistance followed. This photo depicts neighbors Bailey and Duncan amidst the rubble of Bailey's bombed out living room. City officials zoned African American neighborhoods as commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character, thereby enabling polluting industries to locate there, lowering African American property values while enhancing the value of white neighborhoods. Of course, this had huge consequences to the health of the people living in such polluted neighborhoods. This is data reflecting Los Angeles, showing, among other things, that Black children are 3 times more likely to have elevated lead levels in their blood. The construction of freeways, BART, commercial and upscale residential developments, and parks, which vastly increased the productivity and wealth for the entire region, were often routed through African American neighborhoods, destroying their homes and businesses. One study in 2007 found that between 1949 and 1973, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities, resulting in 1 million people being displaced, but 2/3 of those people being African American. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district. resulting in 20,000 African-American residents being displaced, 883 African-American businesses destroyed. 10 years later, in the 1960s, the city decided that Japantown was blighted and used eminent domain to destroy property owned by Japanese Americans there, including a 4-flat hotel owned by my family, reducing Japantown from 44 blocks to 4. Likewise, in the 1960s, Hayward wiped out an unincorporated area known as Russell City to make way for a huge Calpine power plant, and 1,400 Black and Latino residents lost their homes, many never to be homeowners again. The task force is grateful. I want to do a shout out to the Burgess family members for shining a light on the state's unjust taking of their family property in Coloma that now comprises the Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. Their testimony prompted the task force to recommend that the legislature restore property now acquired by the state back to its original owners, or failing that, at least to provide compensation. The nation was enriched not only by 2.5 centuries of free labor and generational enslavement, but also by the iterations of racial exclusion that continued for more than 100 years thereafter into modern times, resulting in, as Rabbi Eilberg had stated, cumulative, compounding, and cascading consequences. If you only remember one slide in this presentation, let it be this one. The history of racial exclusion is depicted as an arc of about 4 centuries, during which racial oppression predominated, and only in recent years did it begin to retreat. Even this image is misleading in that it suggests that in 1954, when the Supreme Court outlawed segregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education, it ended segregation. Far from it. Fierce resistance to the struggle for equal rights occurred all over the nation. Assembly member Reggie Jones Sawyer, who's on the task force, his uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine who defied the school board in Little Rock, 200 National Guard, and an angry white mob threatening to kill them merely for registering to go to school at Little Rock Central High, notwithstanding Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. This arc gives you an idea of the enormous long-term cost of discrimination to African Americans. With respect to housing and education, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The wholesale exclusion of African Americans from equal education, employment, the benefits of the New Deal, federally insured home loans, the ability to live in the suburbs, and other opportunities has resulted in white households having 9 times more assets than Black households, Black people having shorter life expectancies than the rest of the population. In San Francisco, as of 1921, Black infant mortality rate was 5 times that of white babies, and huge disparities that persist in housing, houselessness, policing, criminal justice, and in almost all other aspects of American life. So as Rabbi Eilberg had mentioned, reparations is not a handout. It is not welfare. It is a communal obligation. It is a debt owed for wrongs of the past 400 years, resulting from stolen lives, wages, property, and opportunities. To those who would say these wrongs, they happened a long time ago. So why should today's taxpayers have to pay for it? I say this debt is a collective one. Rabbi Eilberg called it a communal obligation. And just as any other societal debt that the nation incurred years, decades, or even more than a century ago, such as from, to list, wars, public works projects, natural disasters, human-caused wrongs, such as contamination, Superfund sites, pension and social security disbursements, and other entitlements, all costing enormous amounts of money. This is all part of the same collective obligation of what it means to live in a society. As one example, a 2013 analysis of federal payment records revealed that the government is still making monthly payments to relatives of Civil War veterans, despite news media erroneously reporting that the task force has recommended specific compensation, individual compensation of 1.2 million or billions. We have never recommended as this state task force, nor will we recommend that the state pay any specific amount. What we will do is present an array of approximately 115 proposals for the legislature to consider. Yes, individual compensation is among the proposals for descendants of persons enslaved in America, but by far, the overwhelming majority of the proposals involve policy reforms in healthcare, housing, education, employment, criminal justice, and other areas reflecting huge and growing disparities. It is now up to the legislature to consider not just individual compensation, but the dozens of policy recommendations to stop the harm from continuing and to determine a feasible approach spanning years to address harms that have been decades, if not centuries, in the making. The task force will present the final report to the legislature on June 29, 2023, and after that submission, we will sunset. And then finally, as the only member in the task force who's not African American, you might ask, why am I involved in this issue? And for those on this Zoom call who are not African American, you might find some commonality in what I'm about to say. While there's no equivalence between the discrimination that Japanese Americans experience in centuries of racial oppression endured by African Americans, we do know something about racial profiling, about exclusion, about the unjust taking of property. My family was among the 120,000 Americans forced out of their homes at gunpoint and incarcerated in 10 concentration camps merely because they happened to look like the enemy. In 1942, the first place that my mother and father, along with 8,000 Bay Area Japanese Americans, were incarcerated were the horse stalls at Tanforan Racetrack. It's now a shopping center. But way back then, it was a racetrack in San Bruno, turned into a temporary holding pen surrounded by barbed wire and machine gun towers. They didn't miss the irony that the racetrack's restrooms and drinking fountains were segregated by signs marked white and color, indicative of how deeply Jim Crow had infected California. In 1942, Bay Area resident Fred Korematsu challenged the constitutionality of the mass roundup, and to Fred's surprise, the Supreme Court ruled in 1944 against him, accepting as true without trial the Army's bald assertions that Japanese Americans were spying. So it was a military necessity, the court concluded, to incarcerate them all. There was only one thing wrong with this narrative. It was entirely made up, and the government knew it at the time. 37 years later, I served on the legal team that reopened the Korematsu case. We uncovered secret wartime Justice Department memos from the Navy, the FBI, the Federal Communications Commission, and other reports admitting that Japanese Americans had committed no wrong, that there was no reason to lock them up, and that the Army's claims of espionage were, quote, intentional falsehoods. This evidence was suppressed in order to manipulate the outcome of the Korematsu decision. In October of 1983, before San Francisco courtroom packed with camp survivors, Federal District Court Judge Marilyn Hall Patel ruled that the government had lied and falsified evidence and threw out Fred Korematsu's criminal conviction. This ruling boosted our 20-year movement for reparations. Today, many Japanese American groups are supporting reparations for African Americans. Why? Let me answer that by juxtaposing two seemingly unrelated historical events. In 1943, 63-year-old James Wakasa was confined at Topaz concentration camp in Utah, along with Fred Korematsu, my mother and father, and about 10,000 other Americans. One evening, Wakasa took a stroll along the camp's barbed wire fence line. From 300 yards away, a sentry-atop a guard tower took aim and fired, the bullet striking Wakasa in the chest and killing him. No inquest was held. The guard was exonerated after claiming Wakasa was trying to escape. 2 years later, 1945, O'Day Short, his wife Helen, 7-year-old Carol Ann, and 9-year-old son Barry moved into the house they built in Fontana, California. Sheriffs warned Short they should go back to their Black neighborhood. His real estate agent advised, "Vigilantes had a meeting here last night, and if I were you, I'd get my family out of here." 2 weeks later, an explosion engulfs the house. Neighbors saw Helen try to beat back the flames, consuming her children. All family members died. The San Bernardino District Attorney's Office decided it was an accident. The California Attorney General concluded that no evidence of vigilante activity could be found in Fontana. Other than the fact that these seemingly disparate events occurred within 2 years of each other, what ties them together? I think the answer is that the hate resulting in the deaths of James Wakasa and the O'Dell Short family has its origins in the racism that propped up the institution of slavery and its aftermath. Slavery has existed for thousands of years, but it was only in the past 400 to 500 years that white Europeans developed a type of enslavement based on skin color that was permanent, it was inheritable, it was multi-generational, and it was upheld by a culture of white superiority. Once the culture of 1619 used race to dehumanize people to the level of pigs and goats, in the words of Martin Luther King, thingifying them, then the most heinous crimes against humanity could follow without a second thought. Following the end of slavery, this cultural norm, valuing white lives above all others, morphed into forms of hate that put a target on the backs of not just African Americans, but other people of color, including James Wakasa. Simply put, if you can thingify Black people, then demonizing any other disfavored group du jour is easy. Slavery begat the cultural foundation of America's racial hierarchy of white people on top, Black and Native people on the bottom, and everybody else somewhere in between. And as long as the racial pathology that originated so long ago remains unreckoned with, the racial hierarchy that it spawned will numbingly recycle. We need only to look at recent history to know this is true. When Asian Americans were blamed for the Chinese virus, when Mexicans were called drug dealers and rapists, when insinuations were floated that Muslim and South Asian Americans were terrorists, when white supremacists declared that Jews and immigrants are poised to replace them, when LGBTQ people were demonized, and when one more African American among countless others was killed during an encounter with law enforcement, and it barely evoked a shrug because it's so normal. No, our response to these events cannot be a shrug. This time our response should be different. And what is necessary is to dismantle the systems that created these outcomes in the first place. In doing that, we need to remember that each time America has owned up to its collective wrongs, repaired them, and become more inclusive and more faithful to its ideals, our nation has become stronger, better, and a more perfect union. So I'm going to stop here. I thank you for this and turn it back to Rabbi Alberg to pose a few questions and have further discussion.
Well, I want to just pause for a moment for the rousing standing ovation that we would be offering you if we were present in the same room. So please take that in, even though we're in virtual space. Gosh, I have so many questions of my own, and some wonderful questions have come in, which soon you'll see in the chat as well, Don. Let me think about where to begin. I guess it's here. The first question really is, what happens next? What happens when the task force sunsets and the recommendations are sent to the legislature? Can you predict for us or describe for us what the process is likely to be? And related to that is, what is our role? What will our role be as citizen activists in creating the groundswell support that may be persuasive for the legislature?
Senator Stephen Bradford and Assembly Member Reggie Jones Sawyer, they know that they have a heavy burden to basically take the 115 or more proposals and begin to move them to the legislature. But the key to this whole thing is moving the needle of public opinion so that the legislature has a political will to actually do something. And so we will sunset on July 1 this year, and we're no longer in existence. But actually, that's when the real work begins. And so, among other things, Ann Rubin and others have been working hard to launch, among other things, an endorsement campaign of groups endorsing, at some level they feel comfortable, reparations. And we now have 228 endorsing organizations. Just yesterday it was 219. So it's literally growing by the day. And they include some of the civil rights groups that you'd expect, like the ACLU, but they also include the Los Angeles County Bar Association, one of the biggest bars in the nation, the Bar Association of San Francisco. It includes the California Wellness Foundation, $1 billion philanthropy. It includes many social service organizations up and down California. It includes multiracial organizations. I'm very happy to say that Japanese American and Asian American groups show up visibly, and delighted to have the support of the faith community there as well, including the San Francisco Interfaith Council, the Jewish organizations and congregations that Ann Rubin has been helped to get, and I'm sure with your support on this, people on this call, the Tri-City Interfaith Council over on the East Bay side, and others. So the idea is to get support from every single sector and then create new centers of organizing. I mean, the center in the metaphorical sense for the effort is the task force. But when we sunset and no longer in existence, we need to decentralize that effort and have lots of different centers of organizing to spread the word. So the endorsement list can be found on the website supportreparations.org. Very easy to remember, supportreparations.org. And it allows people to endorse at a level they feel comfortable with. I mean, some groups are all in. They'll say, we endorse the task force, we endorse the interim report, we like the proposals that are being proposed. There are others who are more cautious, who want to say, we endorse the interim report, looks great. We want to wait and see what the proposal look like before we endorse further. And so that website has kind of a menu of options with asterisks, and people can qualify endorsements if they want. But the point of it is to let the public, let the media know, let the legislature know that it's time to seriously consider reparations in all of its many, many forms. So to answer your question, Rabbi Eilberg, we've got to do organizing, we've got to move the needle of public opinion, and we're depending upon groups like the San Francisco Black and Jewish Unity Coalition to help us, and other groups.
So just to make that a little bit more specific, beyond the supportreparations.org endorsement, if I were talking with a particular organization And they would say, well, you know, how specifically is it Stephen Bradford? Who in the legislature? What's sort of when we're organizing people, what are we asking them to do
I
beyond
think,
signing endorsement?
yeah, for purposes, the first thing is to be familiar with the proposals that are being thrown out there. And I want to emphasize that we're not the last word in this, and we're not the only word in this. The proposals cover healthcare, education, housing, policing, and so on, many of the areas that you're already studying. So if there's anything in there that is incomplete, or you've got a better way of doing things, or it's, you know, there's a disagreement, you think there's alternative proposals that should be posed, we need people to have their input. So basically the idea here is this is the beginning of getting the ball rolling. So of course, let your representative know in the Assembly and the state Senate that you're following this and you support it. And I don't think there's going to be 100% agreement on every single proposal, but there's going to be enough there for people to fall behind. And I think there's too many to be in one bill. And as we talked about, this is not a one and done. Senator Bradford is saying California devoted just a 0.5% of the state's budget, and to generate $1 billion or more a year just devoted for reparations. That would be a start, and that it has to be a commitment that spans years and is not just, you know, in and out. And so there'll be years in which the budget is in deficit. There'll be years in which the budget will be in excess. But we've got to have a consistent approach to address these things, irrespective, as we do with everything else, every other line item. So, and then there are representatives in other areas of the state who you may have contact with in other parts of the state. And maybe that it's chapters and congregations of this organization that can begin to do the reach out. But we need to spread this into the mainstream. And just in terms of demographic numbers, you know, Japanese Americans would have never gotten anything passed whatsoever without getting help from allies and people in the mainstream. I mean, we're a tiny population. African Americans are 6% of California's population, 14% of the country. African Americans should lead this, but allies and a real showing of solidarity is absolutely necessary to get anything done. And, you know, in the face of the narratives that are coming out, and among other things, Barbara Albert, you kind of mentioned them, you know, some of them are like, you know, this is welfare, this is, why should I have to pay for this kind of thing? This happened, you know, slavery happened a long time ago, not realizing that slavery was just the start of a culture and systems that have perpetuated this. We need to get that counter narrative out, and who better to do that than folks like you on this Zoom call. So, you know, 500 pages of an interim report. We call it the Book of Truth, actually, because history's been so suppressed. But we need to make it in, you know, bite-sized ways that people can digest information. And if people in congregations are artists or writers, or they can do 15-second TikToks, they can use humor, irony, metaphors to communicate this. We need messaging. So again, there's lots of different ways. It just, I think our only limits are our imagination. So And maybe we can look to how other attitudes have changed, whether it's marriage equality or in other kinds of movements that have been successful, how the needle of public opinion has been changed, has been moved.
Yeah, I know a bit about that, having lived in Minnesota when we lived through the marriage amendment and were successful. And I think that was a massive organizing effort, the principle of which was that each person should organize the people in their sphere of influence, that everyone should speak to 10 people with whom they were in relationship, and then another 10, and then another 10, and watching it
Fantastic.
radiate out. So that's kind of what I'm hearing on the in one sense, specific legislators, maybe the Jewish caucus, by the way, but also each of us, each person on the call should think about who's in my sphere of influence, and what can I do to persuade them to step up on this. It was so moving to listen to you talk about your particular relationship to this issue as a Japanese American. And I'm sure that many of the Jews on the call were thinking similarly, that we as a targeted group, at least in one case, in the case of the Nazi genocide, that we did receive reparations from Germany. Do you think that non-Black targeted groups have a particular role to play in the campaign moving forward, the public education and advocacy campaign?
If you're asking, personalizing it, for people who know something about what it means to be targeted, the way I view what happened to Japanese Americans and the 4 years in America's concentration camps, I now, after being on this task force for 2 years, I now come to believe that our history is a subchapter, really, in biases and racial pathologies that began with manifest destiny, and that it's okay to commit genocide against Native people, and certainly the values that propped up the institution of slavery. And once again, a society can do that, then it's easy to demonize any other group. I mean, California history is really a great lesson on that. It entered the Union in 1850, and among the first things it did with Peter Burnett, the first governor of California, was to target Black people. I mean, with legislation, exclusionary laws, he had migrated himself from Oregon, in which he unsuccessfully tried to exclude and close the borders to African Americans entering that state, and then he moved down to California. But at that time, in the 1850s and late 1800s, there are actually very few African Americans in California. And yet all this legislation was targeted at Native people and African Americans. Why? And it's because it has this origin in something that occurred, a century or more before. And then because of the absence of African Americans in California, who became the targets? Well, the targets became Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, and Native people, and Latinx people. So between the late 1800s and 1935, there were about 350 people lynched in California, 8 of whom were African Americans, but the rest of them were Chinese Americans and Latinx and Native people. So it's like the canon just got shifted. So I think there's a way for folks to identify with this movement and to understand that we need to compensate the injured class of people, for sure. We also need to stop the harm from continuing. But in unpacking reparations, all of it, what it really means, and it means more than a check in the mail, it exposes all of this other stuff that ultimately it just recycles. It happens over and over again. And it moves from pathology moves from one target to another. So justice is part of it, morality is part of it, but also it's in everybody's interest. It's in the country's interest to finally confront this, because it keeps reappearing and churning into new iterations, and old ones too. So I think that's part of the job of making this a justice issue, and that everybody can relate to. But I do want to put front and center the population, especially of descendants of enslaved people, has pretty much been invisibilized. This is something we have in the Jewish community has experienced also, and certainly in the Asian American community. What it means to be viewed as an outsider, perpetual foreigner, to be less than. And so, but here's an opportunity to fix that. I don't know that answers your question. But.
Well, that's great. And there are lots of really wonderful questions coming in. Unfortunately, I won't get to ask all of them to you. I hope that someone will share with you the chat so you can see all the extraordinary stuff that's coming in. By the way, there's a suggestion that I want to be sure you hear. There needs to be some way to have the legislature view your talk tonight and your presentation, maybe and another suggestion that getting KQED engaged. And I know they've done some work, doing some more work on this. So just passing that along as part of the public education campaign. A number of people are asking about their confusion and the confusion of other people between the California Task Force and the San Francisco Committee, and especially the recommendation of $5 million individual payments and how the press blew that up. And so that becomes the face of reparations. How can you help us untangle that confusion in our conversation?
Yeah, so we support, there are about 40 truth and reconciliation and reparations committees or commissions nationwide. I mean, there are in cities. California is the only state that has made this commitment and devoted very significant resources to this. The interim report is 500-page book of truth. As I said, at least 75 people working on it, lawyers, PhDs within the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office, universities, professors. The state of California, it's the only one that's made this huge commitment to move on this. But there are about 30 or 40 committees looking into their own history, like Providence, Rhode Island, and its role in the slave trade, Evanston, New York, that benefited greatly from the slave trade, and of course in the South. And so why is this happening? Why is it so splintered? And the answer is Congress has not even shown the will to study this, let alone to do anything about reparations. I think everybody in the call is aware of this. So, 1988, Congress passed the Civil Liberties Bill of Civil Liberties Act for 1988 for Japanese Americans, providing some monetary atonement. And that was actually the result of two bills. We had a bill in 1980 just to create a commission to study what happened, because most Americans, including our own community, had no idea what happened to us, nor did anybody know what happened and what the government did. And so the strategists concluded that they could never get legislation through until they educated the public. So 10 hearings were held nationwide, got a lot of national attention, ultimately culminated in a money bill in 1988. Well, 1 year after, Representative John Conyers of Detroit, Michigan, proposes basically the study bill, to form a commission to shine a light on what's happened over 400 years. And for many, many years, he's gotten a handful of co-sponsors. he's passed away, and then other members of Congress has taken this up. It's gotten something like 200 co-sponsors now, but it's never had a floor vote, and it won't get a floor vote given the composition of the House and the Senate. And this is only to study it, you know. Congress has been unwilling. So after the Floyd murder, California, Shirley Weber, you know, just decided to plunge ahead, knowing that the source of this harm is really the government, the federal government. But California has participated willingly in the harm. And so the numbers that our economists looked into in terms of putting an economic number on the harm is all based on California harms. It's like California's role in redlining, California's role in eminent domain. But the idea, I think, strategically is if we can get some traction here, then other states would pick it up. And then the conversation will move eastward and ultimately percolate up to Congress. So regrettably, everything is being done in kind of a piecemeal kind of way. But that's better than no conversation whatsoever, which has been the case. So there's little coordination going on, but I'm hoping as the conversation matures, there will be. And the interim report is just one example. I think it's the report that HR 40 would have produced if it ever passed. Each chapter starts out with a national scene, what happened nationally in education, in employment, in racial terror, in political disenfranchisement. And then it ends with what California did in terms of that harm. Every state and every city has its own story and what happened in their particular location. And the sad part about it is, as you all know, everybody got in this game, you know, whether it was lawyers, insurance companies, slave owners, business people, churches, institutions of higher education. Nobody's clean in it. And, you know, it was part of the, you know, racial capitalism, as people call it, and every state. So it's easy to augment. And so I think other states and other locales can use this as a base model and then build on as just one example of and the first element of change is shining a light on the truth. So now I know in 37 states, they've either passed legislation that's pending to regulate how teachers teach history in abandoned books. And California is moving the other way. So there is a culture war going on, but I think all of us can play a role in that also, that the truth is better than darkness, kind of thing.
Truth is better than darkness. Yeah, that's sort of where I wanted to go next. There was a beautiful question, someone asking you what are the obstacles that you face right now, and I would expand that to what expressions of resistance do you encounter most often, and can you guide us a little more in how we should talk with our loved ones, our work partners, our other community members whom we bump into who don't understand yet?
Yeah, I mean, certainly one is the sticker shock of the numbers, and whether it's San Francisco's committee's 5 million, or, you know, we did hire 4 economists to calculate harm in 5 areas. And those were the only areas that there was data to actually do an economic calculation. Like for a lot of the areas of harm, like lynching, there isn't any economic data. I mean, you know, or how do you economically calculate the harm of segregation in schools? But for eminent domain, you can do a calculation. You could say, figure out, okay, what was the value of this house that was destroyed? What was the owner paying? What's the value of it worth now? Was the homeowner able to buy another piece of property? And there's a number to that. And even in doing those numbers, It is a ginormous, it is humongous number. It's astronomical. And I mean, our feeling on the task force is that America needs to know the extent of the harm, of how bad this was and is. And when you reveal it like that, because it's never been done before, it's shocking. It's huge. And people think immediately, this is unaffordable. We can't do this. And there is that sticker shock element. I mean, unlike other areas, we've said, look, this is the number. Look at it. So, you know, soak it in. We're not asking the state to pay that number, but the legislature has to figure out how to balance all of these things. And we're not saying that individual compensation, whatever number you choose, is more important than reducing infant mortality. We're saying, as legislators, you need to take this on and figure it out. But the numbers are daunting. And the thing about it, Rabbi Albert, I've talked to so many journalists to say that the same thing. And the articles still come out with California, you know, is telling the legislature it needs to pay this amount of money. A lot of it is based on ignorance. I mean, George Will, if you look at yesterday's op-ed piece in the Washington Post, it goes on, it's a collection of all the typical pushbacks that we're getting. So if you want to see what the typical ones are, there they are. And they're like, this happened a long time ago. California was not a slave state, but yet it's wading into this issue. Why is it doing that? It's got misplaced priorities. It's got when there are crime in the streets, and it invites you know, theft in stores. It's dealing with reparations. Why is it doing this? And there's a characterization. He uses the word, it's silliness. You know, it's trivializing this and ridiculing. And so that's the narrative. But there is a counter narrative. And the counter narrative is it's not just slavery. That was the beginning of this. And then it just kept compounding in one form or another. And unless there's an intervention, it's just going to get worse. And so, but ordinary folks, we need to have that conversation. Now, how that's done, of course, there are folks who will never, we are unpersuadable. And we have found out during the Trump years how difficult this has been. After all, there are millions of people that no matter what the evidence shows, believe that the elections were stolen. But at the same time, just in our corner of the world here, we've never had 228 organizations say, yeah, it's time to study reparations. That's never happened in California. And mainstream groups are now saying this. So I think there's hope here. And it begins with, you know, each of us. I love your idea of, you know, 10 people to talk to 10 other people. I just begin. And people won't agree initially, I think, but it's a matter of conditioning people. And if Japanese American redress and reparations is any example, I mean, even within our own community, people said, this is impossible. This is preposterous. Don't even bring it up. And marriage equality is another example. Or for that matter, you know, I'm old enough to remember, and people on this call, I could tell by the gray hairs, you're old enough to remember too, when Martin Luther King was alive, and the press would say, what does the Negro want? And you're moving too fast, and all of this stuff. And to ridicule it, to trivialize it, to make it sound preposterous. And so that's what we're up against, but that's part of this process of persuading people.
Well, there's so many more questions I'd like to ask you and continue to learn from you, and all sorts of really wonderful questions and comments in the chat. but I think I need to turn it back to Bobby. I just want to say I'm so grateful for your work, Don, and you and your colleagues. And I have to say that it makes me happy having spent just a couple of hours in planning time with you. I've heard you say, there are 200 some organizations now listed. There, even you who know, all the worst of the details. It seems like you're feeling some sense of forward movement. So I want to bless you and all of us that we're going to continue to feel that, and we're going to continue to contribute that. And we're each going to leave this call even more committed than we have already been to do our part to spread and deepen this conversation throughout our society, and to work to see California be a leader in the movement toward justice. Thank you.
I could add one other thing just for information. I'm looking at some of the questions in the chat. And if you Google California Reparations Task Force and under reports and look under the May 6th meeting, everything that I'm referring to is, you can look at it, like the 115 proposals. There's 100 pages on reparations movements that have happened both in the United States and globally. And so examples ranging from, compensation for in South Africa, or U.S. Atrocities in like the Tuskegee experiments, or like 9/11, what after that compensation that was paid to families and their descendants. And so there are ideas there. So the idea was to collect all of these things and get the conversation started. I'm not of the mind that there's one way of doing this, and there's only one form of reparations. There is a definition of reparations I think we have to respect. And you laid it out, Rabbi Alberg, beautifully about, how cultures define reparations. And we, as part of the statute, were to follow the UN standards of reparations. And then, so there is a screen there. It's not like anything goes. But if you look at the material, there's lots of ideas and examples of what has been done in other areas, other countries, and within the nation itself.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Back to you.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's probably the best word I can describe. This was an extremely powerful discussion, which included both broad stroke educational components and specific actions individuals and organizations can do. And I just wanted to give a special, huge thanks to Rabbi Amy for your moderation, and Don for being willing to speak with us here tonight, to be able to share this information, to be able to share next steps. What are other things that we can do? It's funny because when we were planning and coordinate this event tonight, I asked Anne, I was like, do you think we're going to be able to get enough questions, for Don tonight? And she's like, that's not going to be a problem. And she was completely right. I want to give a special thanks to Anne for continuously spearheading and really taking the lead with the Black and Jewish Unity Coalition, and helping us continue to move the needle forward and push the discussions, and really to figure what's those next steps. I saw Carol mention it's time for action. There's been enough discussions, and that's really what we want to invite you to be able to, whether you want to join our entire coalition, whether you want to be able to come to one of our specific committees, whether that's the Criminal Justice and Prison Reform Committee, our Civic Engagement, our Health and General Welfare, or our Community and Economic Development Committee. All of those committees, reparations crosses and intersects with each of those four committees. And we would love to have anybody, even though we're named the San Francisco Black and Jewish Unity Coalition, we do not discriminate. Anybody from any race, any ethnicity, we invite you to come to one of our meetings. Of what we will do to be able to extend this invitation to you is we will be following up with an email on how to contact us. We already have a lot of your information from your registration, so we will follow up with that email, let you know how to contact us if you want to get involved in a specific committee, want to come to one of our next meetings. we strongly encourage you to come, to continue to push the needle forward, to continue to push this fight, because there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, a lot of next steps, whether that's, you know, on the ground level, whether that's at the top level with the advocacy, the legislation. We need your support. We need and want your help. Just showing up tonight, spending 90 minutes, I don't think was enough time. I really would have liked to have been here a lot longer. And I think a lot of us, you know, with the questions and with the things that we still want to know, there's space and there's room for that, for those continued discussions. With that, I want to be mindful of everybody's time and respectful of everybody's time. And I just want to, once again, send a huge thanks to Rabbi Amy, to Don, to Ann, to all of you who have joined us tonight for this powerful discussion. And we truly, truly appreciate all of you coming tonight to hear about this subject. With that, I will end the recording, and we will be in contact with each of you soon.